The fascination with darkness has accompanied humanity since the first conscious mind gazed into the abyss of night and wondered what terrors or treasures might dwell beyond the reach of firelight. Yet there exists a darkness more profound than any external void, a darkness that dwells within the architecture of consciousness itself, unseen yet ever present, denied yet demanding recognition. This is the darkness that Carl Gustav Jung termed the shadow, and it is the same darkness that medieval alchemists encoded in their cryptic manuscripts as the Nigredo, the blackening, the first death that precedes all authentic transformation. The solar eclipse serves as nature's most potent metaphor for this psychological phenomenon. When the moon passes before the sun, the world does not merely lose light. It undergoes a momentary ontological shift, a suspension of the natural order that our ancestors interpreted as divine communication, celestial warning, or cosmic rupture. The birds fall silent, the temperature drops, shadows sharpen into unnatural clarity. For those precious minutes, day becomes a stranger to itself, revealing that even the most reliable constant in human experience, the sun's illumination, can be obscured, interrupted, negated. But what if this astronomical event mirrors a perpetual condition within human consciousness? What if each individual carries within themselves a perpetual eclipse, a moon of repression, denial, and unconscious material that perpetually obscures the solar brilliance of integrated selfhood? This is not merely poetic speculation, but the foundational insight of depth psychology as Jung conceived it. And remarkably, it was prefigured centuries earlier in the symbolic language of alchemy. The Hermetic practitioners of medieval Europe and Renaissance Italy were not, as popular caricature suggests, merely proto-chemists fumbling toward the periodic table. They were philosophers of transformation, whose external experiments with base metals served as elaborate metaphors for internal processes of psychic transmutation. When they spoke of turning lead into gold, the most sophisticated among them understood this as the conversion of unconscious, dense, unintegrated psychic material into conscious, refined, individuated being. The alchemical laboratory was a theater of the soul, and the substances they manipulated were projections of internal realities they could not yet name in psychological language. The convergence of Jungian psychology and alchemical philosophy is not coincidental. Jung himself, during his most profound period of personal crisis, what he would later describe as his confrontation with the unconscious, turned to alchemical texts for illumination. In those obscure treatises filled with bizarre imagery of hermaphrodites, lions devouring suns, and kings drowning in mercurial seas, Jung recognized a systematic mapping of the individuation process, the hero's journey into the depths of psyche that every conscious being must undertake, if they are to achieve psychological wholeness. This essay explores that convergence, examining how the alchemical Nigredo, the darkening, the putrefaction, the descent into shadow, corresponds precisely to the Jungian encounter with repressed unconscious material. It is an investigation into the solar eclipse within, that necessary obscuration of conscious identity that alone makes possible the emergence of authentic selfhood. Carl Gustav Jung's break with Sigmund Freud was not merely professional rivalry, but a fundamental philosophical rupture regarding the nature and purpose of the unconscious mind. Where Freud conceived the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed sexual and aggressive impulses, a psychic basement where civilized consciousness discarded its embarrassing refuse, Jung perceived something far more expansive and ultimately creative. For Jung, the unconscious was not merely personal but collective, not merely repressive but generative, not merely pathological but potentially redemptive. The shadow, in Jungian terminology, represents the personal unconscious, those aspects of oneself that consciousness finds incompatible with its self-image and therefore relegates to darkness. These are not necessarily evil qualities, though they may be socially unacceptable. The shadow contains everything we have disowned: our aggression and creativity, our sexuality and spontaneity, our selfishness and vitality. It is the unlived life, the road not taken, the self we might have been had we chosen differently or been born into different circumstances. Crucially, Jung insisted that integration of the shadow is not optional for those seeking psychological health. The shadow denied does not disappear, but instead operates autonomously, projecting itself onto others, erupting in destructive behaviors or manifesting as neurotic symptoms. The eclipse cannot be prevented by wishing for perpetual daylight. Denial only ensures that when darkness comes, it arrives with chaos rather than insight. This is where alchemical philosophy provides an uncannily precise symbolic parallel. The Nigredo, or blackening stage, was described by medieval alchemists as the most necessary and most dreaded phase of the great work. It involved the putrefaction of the prima materia, the raw, unrefined substance that served as the starting point for transmutation. Texts describe this stage with visceral imagery: rotting corpses, decaying matter, crows and ravens circling carrion, descents into underworld realms. The Rosarium Philosophorum, one of the most influential alchemical texts, depicts the Nigredo as a death, specifically the death of the old king, the previous order, the established identity that must dissolve before new life can emerge. The psychological parallel is exact. The Nigredo corresponds to the confrontation with the shadow, that moment when the carefully constructed persona, the social mask we present to the world, proves inadequate to contain the totality of who we are. This crisis typically arrives unbidden, through failure, loss, illness, or simply the accumulated weight of unlived life asserting its claim on consciousness. The individual experiences this as depression, meaninglessness, or what St. John of the Cross termed the dark night of the soul. The old identity is undergoing putrefaction, rotting away to reveal the raw prima materia of authentic being beneath the social veneer. Alchemists understood that this stage could not be rushed or bypassed. The Nigredo had its own timeline, its own organic unfolding. Attempts to escape it or move prematurely to the next stage would only ensure that the final product remained impure, that the gold would contain base metal, that the transformation would be incomplete. Similarly, Jung observed that patients who attempted to evade their confrontation with the shadow, through spiritual bypassing, intellectualization, or medication without integration, inevitably found themselves cycling back to the same crisis, often with amplified intensity. The alchemical texts also emphasized that the Nigredo contained hidden potential. In the very darkness of putrefaction, in the apparent death and dissolution, lay the seed of the new. The black crow that symbolized this stage was also said to carry in its beak the white dove of the albedo, the lightning that would follow. This is the paradox at the heart of both alchemy and depth psychology. The very material we most wish to avoid contains the energy necessary for transformation. The shadow is not merely obstacle but resource, not merely prison, but potential. Jung went further, suggesting that the shadow contains not only personal repressed content, but access to the collective unconscious itself, those universal patterns and archetypal energies that exceed individual experience. When we descend into our personal darkness with sufficient courage and consciousness, we discover that we are not alone there. We find myths, symbols, and patterns that have accompanied humanity across cultures and millennia. The solar eclipse within opens onto something transpersonal and numinous. This doctrine has profound implications. It means that psychological wholeness is not achieved through perfection, but through integration, not through transcending darkness, but through consciously incorporating it. It means that the spiritual path does not bypass the psychological, but runs directly through it. And it means that what we most fear in ourselves may contain precisely the vitality, authenticity, and creative potential that consciousness has been desperately seeking in all the wrong places. The alchemists expressed this in their principle of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The old form must be dissolved in the acids of psychological honesty before the new form can crystallize. The solar eclipse must be allowed to complete its passage. Only then can the sun emerge transformed, its light more brilliant for having known the meaning of its own obscuration. The descent into shadow is not a single event, but a process with discernible stages, each with its own challenges, revelations, and requirements. Both alchemical texts and Jungian case studies reveal a consistent pattern to this journey into inner darkness, a morphology of transformation that appears to be embedded in the structure of psyche itself. Stage 1. The call to descent. The journey begins with what Joseph Campbell termed the call to adventure, though in psychological work, this call often arrives as crisis rather than invitation. Something breaks, a relationship ends, a career collapses, a health diagnosis arrives, or simply the meaning that once animated life evaporates, leaving behind only hollow routine. In alchemical terms, this is the recognition that the prima materia is not gold, but lead, not refined but raw, not complete but fundamentally in need of transformation. Jung observed that this call is frequently resisted. The ego, comfortable in its established patterns even if those patterns generate suffering, instinctively recoils from change. Patients arrive in therapy not seeking transformation, but restoration. They want to return to the life they had before the crisis, to repair the persona that has cracked. But true individuation cannot proceed from this defensive position. One must accept that something has genuinely ended, that the old form cannot be resurrected, that death, psychological death, is not the enemy, but the doorway. The alchemical texts speak of the Hermetic seal, the necessity of containing the prima materia in a closed vessel so that the volatile elements cannot escape during the work. Psychologically, this translates to commitment to the process, the decision to remain present to one's own experience rather than seeking distraction, dissociation, or premature resolution. It means entering the analytic vessel, whether through formal therapy, meditation practice, or sustained self-examination, and agreeing not to flee when the material becomes uncomfortable. Stage 2. The confrontation with shadow. Once the descent is consciously undertaken, the individual begins to encounter the contents of the personal shadow in increasing clarity. This typically manifests first through projection. We see in others what we cannot yet acknowledge in ourselves, the anger we've disowned, the neediness we've denied, the grandiosity we've repressed, or the creative wildness we've domesticated into conformity. Dreams become populated with menacing or seductive figures representing these split-off aspects of self. Jung's method here was amplification and active imagination. Rather than merely interpreting shadow material symbolically, he encouraged patients to engage it directly, to dialogue with dream figures, to paint or sculpt the images that arose from the unconscious, to give voice to the disowned parts. This is perilous work, as it requires temporarily relaxing the ego's defensive boundaries and allowing disturbing content to surface into consciousness. The alchemical parallel is the putrefactio, the actual rotting of the substance, which texts describe with almost nauseating specificity. This is not pleasant work. The individual confronting shadow material experiences shame, guilt, horror at what they discover within themselves. The carefully curated self-narrative, I am a good person, I am rational and controlled, I am beyond such base impulses, decomposes under honest scrutiny. One discovers capacity for cruelty, cowardice, pettiness, and perversion. The Nigredo is aptly named. Consciousness itself seems to darken, and the world loses its previous meaning. Yet this very dissolution is necessary. The false persona, the idealized self-image, must die. The alchemists knew this, and depicted it in their most striking image, the mortificatio, the killing of the king, the death of the ruling principle that has governed consciousness. What was once solid becomes fluid. What was once certain becomes questionable. What was once unconscious becomes unbearably conscious. Stage 3. The integration of opposites. As the encounter with shadow deepens, a curious phenomenon occurs. The individual begins to recognize that the qualities they most despised in themselves are not separate from those they most value, but intimately connected to them. The person who prides themselves on rationality discovers that their intuition has been starved, and thus manifests in irrational fears. The individual who identifies with compassion realizes their repressed aggression has been leaking out as passive-aggressive manipulation. The one who lives entirely in the spiritual dimension finds their denied sexuality erupting in compulsive or transgressive behavior. Jung termed this recognition the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, and identified it as the essential psychological task. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to bring the rejected material into conscious relationship with ego awareness. This creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a third position that transcends the binary opposition between conscious and unconscious, between light and shadow. Alchemically, this stage was represented by the image of the hermaphrodite, the rebes or double thing, a figure containing both masculine and feminine, solar and lunar, conscious and unconscious in a single integrated form. This was not androgyny as simple mixture, but a dynamic unity that preserved difference while transcending division. The alchemical hermaphrodite is often depicted standing on sun and moon simultaneously, having achieved a position that includes and balances both principles. The psychological experience of this integration is paradoxical. One simultaneously becomes more oneself and less identified with any single aspect of self. There is expansion. The personality becomes larger, more complex, more capable of containing contradiction. But there is also humility. The inflation of believing oneself purely good or purely conscious deflates in the face of acknowledged shadow. The individual becomes more authentic precisely by becoming less certain of their own righteousness. This stage involves sustained work. Each shadow element must be consciously acknowledged, its energy recognized, its valid needs addressed, and its distorted expressions transformed. The rage in the shadow may contain necessary boundary-setting capacity. The greed may contain healthy self-care. The pride may contain legitimate self-worth. The task is to extract the valid need from the distorted expression and integrate it into conscious life. Stage 4. The withdrawal of projections. As internal integration proceeds, a dramatic shift occurs in external relationships. The figures onto whom one has projected shadow material gradually lose their numinous intensity. The enemy who seemed evil incarnate is recognized as an ordinary person carrying their own unintegrated material. The romantic partner who was idealized as savior is seen as a complex human being with their own shadow. The guru or authority figure onto whom one projected wisdom and power is understood to be simply further along the path, but not fundamentally different in kind. This withdrawal of projections is simultaneously liberating and isolating. Relationships that existed primarily as stages for projection often cannot survive this shift. The dynamic that held them together, whether conflict, idealization, or codependence, dissolves when both parties begin to own their shadow rather than externalizing it. Many marriages, friendships, and professional relationships enter crisis during this stage of individuation. Yet this is also where authentic relationship becomes possible for the first time. When two individuals meet not as projection screens, but as conscious beings who have done sufficient shadow work, they can engage in what Martin Buber termed the I-thou relationship, meeting between whole persons rather than between personas, or between unconscious complexes acting through persons. The alchemical texts describe this stage as the cleansing of the substance, the removal of impurities, the clarification that allows the essential gold to emerge from the dross. In psychological terms, it is the differentiation of self from other, the recognition of where one's psychological material ends and another's begins. This is the work of establishing clear boundaries while maintaining openness, of being fully individual while remaining capable of genuine connection. Stage 5. The emergence of the self. The culmination of the shadow work and the individuation process is not the strengthening of the ego, but the emergence of what Jung termed the self, the totality of conscious and unconscious, the archetype of wholeness that serves as the organizing center of the psyche. This is not the dissolution of ego, but its proper subordination to a larger principle. The ego, which previously believed itself to be the king of consciousness, recognizes itself as the servant of the self, the instrument through which wholeness expresses itself in the world. Alchemically, this is the emergence of the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the goal of the great work. But the texts are clear that the stone is not a substance, but a state, not an object, but a process made permanent. It is the capacity to continuously transform lead into gold, to continually integrate new shadow material as it arises, to remain conscious and adaptive rather than fixed and defended. The individual who has completed sufficient shadow work does not become perfect but becomes authentic. They do not transcend human limitation, but accept it with humor and compassion. They do not escape suffering, but meet it consciously rather than reactively. They discover that the solar eclipse within was not an aberration to be corrected, but a necessary passage, a death that enabled rebirth, a darkness that made light meaningful. There arrives in every genuine psychological and spiritual journey a moment of profound crisis, a point at which the way forward appears impossible. The way back is closed, and the individual stands suspended in a darkness so complete that even the memory of light seems illusory. This is not the ordinary depression of circumstance or chemistry, though it may wear those masks. This is existential despair, the night sea journey, the descent into the underworld from which not all travelers return unchanged, and some do not return at all. Jung himself experienced this crisis acutely during his rupture with Freud, and the subsequent period he termed his confrontation with the unconscious. For years he was assailed by visions, voices, and overwhelming archetypal material that threatened to fragment his sanity. He recorded his experiences in what would later be published as the Red Book, a document of terrifying honesty depicting a psyche in crisis, descending into its own depths without certainty of ascent. Jung emerged from this ordeal transformed, but not unscathed. He carried the marks of that descent for the remainder of his life. The alchemical texts speak of this stage with particular emphasis, describing it as the dark darker than dark, the Nigredo at its most intense. Some texts warn that practitioners who enter this stage without adequate preparation may be destroyed by it, driven mad by the forces they encounter, or become permanently lost in the labyrinths of their own unconscious. The psychological reality they were encoding is simple but terrible. There is a point in shadow work where the structures that have held consciousness together begin to dissolve, and there is a period, sometimes quite extended, before new structures crystallize to replace them. This is the moment when the individual confronts not merely personal shadow, but existential abyss. All the provisional meanings that have animated life reveal themselves as constructions, arbitrary narratives imposed on an indifferent cosmos. The roles one has played, parent, professional, believer, citizen, are seen to be costumes that can be removed, leaving behind a naked self that may amount to nothing more than biological mechanism and cultural conditioning. God, if one has believed, becomes silent or absent. If one has not believed, the absence of transcendent meaning becomes crushing rather than liberating. Viktor Frankl, writing from the different but related context of the concentration camps, observed that those who survived extreme circumstances were not necessarily the physically strongest, but those who retained or discovered a sense of meaning that transcended their immediate suffering. But what happens when the crisis is precisely the collapse of meaning itself? When the depression is not biochemical, but philosophical? When the darkness is not external circumstance, but internal recognition of the void at the foundation of existence? The temptation at this stage is to retreat into any available certainty, however false. Fundamentalisms of all kinds, religious, political, psychological, offer refuge from existential uncertainty. The individual may attempt to reinstall a rigid persona, to re-identify completely with a social role, to become born again into some dogmatic system that promises to contain the chaos. Or they may retreat into cynicism, declaring all meaning illusory and all striving futile, which is simply another form of defense against the genuine encounter with groundlessness. But the authentic passage through this crisis requires remaining present to the void without premature closure. This is extraordinarily difficult. It means tolerating not knowing, accepting that the old answers have genuinely died and the new ones have not yet arrived, living with radical uncertainty about the most fundamental questions of existence. The alchemists called this stage dissolution. The substance must be completely broken down into its constituent elements before it can be reconstituted in a new form. Jung insisted that this crisis, while agonizing, is ultimately productive if consciously endured. The dissolution of ego certainties and provisional meanings creates the space for the emergence of the self, that larger organizing principle that is not constructed by consciousness, but given to it from the depths. But the self cannot emerge while the ego maintains its defensive position, insisting on its own sovereignty and rejecting anything that threatens its control. The psychological requirement here is surrender, but not the surrender of defeat, the surrender of trust. It means descending into the darkness with some faith that the psyche itself contains a telos, a direction, an evolutionary pressure toward wholeness. Jung termed this the prospective function of the unconscious, its capacity to point toward future development even when present consciousness sees only collapse. The mystics of various traditions have described analogous experiences. Meister Eckhart spoke of the soul becoming nothing, so that God could become all. St. John of the Cross detailed the dark night as necessary preparation for union with the divine. Buddhist texts describe the dissolution of self-sense as gateway to awakening. The specific religious language differs, but the phenomenology is remarkably consistent. There is a passage through annihilation that serves as threshold to transformation. In clinical practice, this stage requires exceptional skill and presence from the therapist or guide. The individual in existential crisis is genuinely at risk, the rate of suicide is not negligible, and even those who survive may emerge damaged if the experience is not adequately contained and processed. The task is to provide enough support that the person can tolerate the dissolution without being destroyed by it, but not so much support that they avoid the encounter entirely. The outcome of this crisis cannot be predicted with certainty. Some individuals emerge with profound psychological and spiritual insight, having encountered the depths of their own being and the being of existence itself. Others emerge traumatized, requiring years to rebuild basic structures of meaning and identity. Still others become permanently destabilized, unable to re-establish functional relationship with consensus reality. What determines the outcome? Jung suggested it was the combination of constitutional strength, quality of support, and what he could only describe as grace, something given rather than achieved, a spontaneous movement of the psyche toward wholeness that cannot be compelled, but can be courted through sincere engagement with the depths. The crisis of the soul, then, is simultaneously the most dangerous and most sacred stage of the journey. It is the moment when the solar eclipse within is complete, when darkness has entirely obscured previous light, when nothing remains but the encounter with one's own groundlessness. And it is the moment when, if one can sustain the encounter, something genuinely new becomes possible. Not a return to previous wholeness, but the emergence of a wholeness that includes the darkness, that has been tempered by it, that carries its wisdom forward into transformed life. The emergence from the dark night, the completion of the alchemical Nigredo, does not produce the self one imagined at the journey's beginning. There is no return to innocence, no restoration of the persona that existed before the crisis. What emerges is something more strange, more authentic, and ultimately more valuable than simple restoration could provide, an individuated self that has integrated its shadow and can therefore engage reality with uncommon consciousness. The transformation is not dramatic in the sense that Hollywood depicts. There are no supernatural powers acquired, no visible halos, no transcendence of human limitation. The changes are subtler but more profound. The individual discovers a new relationship to their own psyche, a relationship characterized by curiosity rather than judgment, by acceptance rather than rejection, by complexity rather than splitting. They recognize that they contain multitudes, contradictions, paradoxes, light and shadow in continuous dynamic tension, and that this complexity is not pathology, but the very structure of human consciousness. One of the most striking outcomes of successful shadow integration is the diminishment of psychological projection. Having recognized and accepted the darkness within oneself, one becomes less compelled to see it exclusively in others. The enemy loses some of its charge. The scapegoat is recognized as carrying collective shadow rather than embodying essential evil. This does not mean moral relativism. Genuine harm still requires response, but the quality of that response shifts from righteous condemnation to conscious engagement with destructive dynamics in which one recognizes one's own participation. Alchemically, this stage was termed the rubedo, the reddening, the final transformation that produces the philosopher's stone. The texts describe the substance as having achieved a kind of perfection, but not perfection as static purity. Rather, it has become capable of transforming other substances, of serving as catalyst for further transformation. Psychologically, this means the individuated person becomes capable of facilitating transformation in others, not through teaching doctrine, but through embodying integrated consciousness. Jung observed that patients who successfully completed significant shadow work often experienced a reorientation of life priorities. What previously seemed essential, status, wealth, social approval, recedes in importance. What previously seemed peripheral, authenticity, depth of relationship, creative expression, contributing to the wholeness of the collective, moves to the center. This is not because of moral development in a conventional sense, but because the individual's center of gravity has shifted from ego to self, from persona to essence. This shift manifests in relationships in particular. Whereas before the individual related primarily through projection and persona, the dance of unconscious complexes mistaken for authentic connection, they now become capable of genuine intimacy. They can see the other as other, not as screen for their own internal material. They can tolerate the other's shadow without requiring its suppression or transformation. They can engage in conflict without requiring resolution that eliminates difference. The relationship becomes a vehicle for ongoing mutual individuation rather than a static contract based on complementary neuroses. Yet this new self is not without its burdens. Having seen through the collective illusions that organize much of social life, the individuated person often experiences a kind of loneliness. They can no longer participate unreflectively in the consensus trance, the shared fictions that allow groups to cohere. They see the shadow of the collective, its violence, its conformity, its persecution of difference, with painful clarity. This can lead to exile, either chosen or imposed, from communities that require unconsciousness for membership. Jung warned against inflation at this stage, the temptation to identify with the archetype of the wise old man or woman and assume a position of spiritual superiority. The truly individuated person recognizes that they have not transcended humanity, but become more fully human, which includes accepting limitation, mortality, and the ongoing necessity of consciousness. They know that shadow integration is never complete, that new layers of darkness continually emerge as life presents new challenges, that individuation is not achievement, but process. The fruits of this transformation become visible not in grandiose accomplishment, but in the quality of everyday existence. There is often a deepening of presence, an ability to be fully in the moment without the interference of constant self-monitoring or future anxiety. There is a capacity for joy that is not dependent on external circumstance, arising from the simple fact of being. There is a relationship to suffering that does not seek to eliminate it, but to extract its meaning, to allow it to serve the ongoing work of individuation. Creatively, many individuals experience a renaissance after successful shadow work. The energies that were bound in repression and defense become available for genuine expression. The artist paints with new honesty. The writer finds an authentic voice freed from the need to impress or conform. The scientist pursues questions that genuinely matter, rather than those that secure grant funding or academic prestige. The liberated energy of the integrated shadow fuels work that carries the mark of wholeness. Perhaps most remarkably, those who have genuinely confronted and integrated their shadow often become agents of psychological and cultural transformation simply through their presence. They carry a kind of authority that does not derive from position or credentials, but from depth of being. Others recognize, often unconsciously, that they are in the presence of someone who has undertaken the journey and returned transformed. This creates permission, an implicit message that the journey is possible, that the darkness can be endured, that transformation is not merely metaphor, but lived reality. The alchemical gold, then, proves to be not a substance but a state of being, not an object possessed but a process embodied. It is the capacity to continuously transform base material into refined consciousness, to meet each new challenge with awareness rather than reactivity, to remain in relationship with both light and shadow without identifying exclusively with either. This is the hidden energy of inner darkness, the vitality, authenticity, and creative potential that become available only to those who have courted the eclipse, who have allowed the moon of unconsciousness to pass before the sun of awareness, and who have emerged from that passage forever changed. The eclipse you fear is not the darkness falling upon you, but the light you have been refusing to see. When consciousness finally turns inward, it discovers that the sun it has been worshipping is a pale reflection of the radiance buried in the depths it has spent a lifetime fleeing.